Hello, and thank you all for joining us for this continuing education webinar. I am Aziza Belcher-Platt, the Education and Training Representative for APA's Division 49. And on behalf of Division 49 CE Committee and all of Division 49, we welcome you to this webinar. It's my pleasure to introduce Donna J. Harris, who has a lot of alphabets after her name. She has earned her master's. She's an MSW, an LCSW, and a CGP. She's an African-American licensed clinical social worker with over 30 years, though she doesn't look like it, of practice experience. She is a director of Intercultural Counseling LLC, which provides culturally responsive individual and group psychotherapy to adults. She is certified in relational psychoanalyst, mindful facilitation and group psychotherapy. She facilitates trauma groups, trauma support groups, as well as BIPOC and intercultural training process groups for mental health practitioners. She founded Intercultural Network LLC to address the needs of organizations and their efforts to become more equitable and inclusive by providing customized assessments and training. She frequently presents at local and national organizations interested in cultivating trauma-informed anti-racist practices. She is a qualified administrator for the Intercultural Development Inventory, IDI, and has served as clinical faculty at Bryn Mawr's college graduate assistant college graduate school of social work and social research for 20 years. Mrs. Harris is also president of the Philadelphia Area Group Psychotherapy Society, is chair-elect of AGPA Affiliate Society Assembly, and serves on the board of directors of the American Group Psychotherapy Association. So it is my honor to turn it over to Donna Harris.
Thank you, Aziza. My goodness, that just sounds exhausting.
It sounds impressive.
That sounds exhausting. So, hopefully we'll have a few more people joining us, and depending on how many people are here, it's not that I'm winging this, but I believe in flexibility, depending on the size of the crowd. So, I may switch some things around that I intended to do. But one thing I would like to ask is if it's at all possible, I would like to actually see who I'm talking to. So having screens on because this is a group training and because I talk about mindful communication and so forth, it's really, really challenging for me to talk to little black squares with people's names. So if at all possible, I'd like for people to have their videos on. Um, this is really interesting timing, so I'll talk a little bit about myself and maybe kill a little bit of time and see if some other people join in the meantime. That'll help. So in addition to what Aziza said, which was my professional bio, I think what's really relevant in terms of what I want to talk about tonight and what I tend to talk about is really just who I am as a person and what led me to this work. Obviously, I'm a Black female therapist, but my story started a long time ago. I grew up in Brooklyn, New York, till I was about 10 years old. And then, interestingly enough, my parents thought it was a good idea to move to Brussels, Belgium. So, yes, so we immigrated to Belgium, and I was there from age 10 through 19 or so, which is for me my most formative years, right? So I lived as an immigrant. I had all of the immigrant experiences of parentification, translating for my parents, the whole thing, and became very, very quickly, by necessity, acculturated to Belgian culture, meaning learning the language, being in the schools, and fully entrenched in the society there. And then came back to the United States as an adult. I mean, I used to come back for summers and things like that. But what that meant for me is having this bicultural or multicultural experience, not just with myself and my parents as Americans and being in Belgium, but Belgium also had a lot of immigrants. And at the time, it was also a colonizing country. All right. And that was pretty important as far as my experience goes as well, because for the first time, and probably, I certainly hope the last, I experienced the I want to say I experienced the privilege of being an American citizen. Not something I necessarily think a lot about now or necessarily am that proud about now, but back then, what that meant is this kind of dichotomy between um, having this privilege, having people go, "Oh, wow, you're from the United States. Oh boy," get really excited about it. And at the same time, knowing, witnessing, and watching people who were from what was then the colony of Zaire. Well, it wasn't Zaire then, it was the Belgian colony, and then it became Zaire, being treated very differently than me. And, all of us kind of looking the same or similarly. So that was an interesting experience too, just having that kind of privilege and experiencing being privileged over other people who look like me. So eventually I returned to the United States, went to college, went to grad school, and I ended up marrying a white male, a white American male. And we have two lovely biracial children. Right? So why is all this important? Well, all of it's important because of what I focus on now. Most of my practice, well, my practice, first of all, the name of my practice is intercultural counseling. I also have a business called Intercultural Network. You'll see a theme here, right? The intercultural piece. And the reason that that's a theme is because it fascinated me. It fascinated me when I was an immigrant in Belgium. I used to try to figure out where everyone was from and their nationalities and all of that. And the other piece is that um, I struggled to understand the difficulties that people had communicating with each other, especially around difference. And that's been something I've noticed and, was fascinated by for years. And then it became essential to me as the mother of biracial children that they not be in a situation where they couldn't communicate or people couldn't communicate with them or whatever. It really became a lot of my life's work to work with people around difference. And I had these lofty ideas that I was going to go in and change corporations and do all this really, macro work, and got really frustrated very quickly doing that and decided, let me just stick with what I know. Let me stick with working with clinicians who want to do this work, who want to improve. Um, so I'm going to make one more plea for people to turn on their video, because this is going to be not me. What I don't do is I don't come to presentations and just read at people. In part because I hate it when I go someplace, I'm like, I could read your paper at home. Why am I here if you're just going to read to me? So while I will be reading some excerpts, because the timing is interesting, I just had a book chapter come out. Alexis Abernathy has a book out on working with diversity in groups, which she edited. So I have a chapter in there, and I'm pulling a lot of what I'm doing tonight from that chapter, hoping that it'll be of interest to folks. It literally will be published, what is it today? Tomorrow there. So it's hot off the presses. But so I'm going to pick on you. Are people able to unmute and turn on their video? Because I have no idea if you're even in the space. I don't know if anyone's here other than one person.
Well, I sent invitations to start video to folks.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
So I'm hoping that Emily has said she'll start her video later.
Okay. Is
Um,
it
Annalise's video is actually on, but we don't see her, so I don't know what's
that's
happening there.
interesting.
Yeah.
Maybe folks could, text you back or whatever as to what's going on, whether or not we have any technical issues or whatever. And whoever's here, I'd like to hear from you. I'd like to know your name and how to pronounce your name so I don't mess it up. So I have one person on. There we go.
Here.
Hi.
Yes.
Hi.
Oh, yeah, so
Tell
you
me
can.
how to pronounce your name.
My name is Ildiko,
Aldiko.
and I live in San Francisco, and I am an immigrant. I will have a client in an hour, so I'll have to bow out. Sorry, I just wanted to be here as much as I can, and so here I am.
Oh, I appreciate that. I also appreciate you letting me know that you'll have to bow out, so I don't think it's something I said. But thanks so much for coming tonight.
So yeah, it's exciting to hear that you were an immigrant in Europe, and I grew up in Hungary. My Hungarian name and my accent are with me, but I have been in the US. I was in Boston for 11 years and now 13, 16 years in California.
Mhm, mhm, mhm.
I'm excited to hear what you have to say.
Okay. Just because you're talking to me and I can pick on you, what excited you about this topic? What brought you here?
Well, I'm a group therapist, so this is the Division 49 event.
Mhm.
I don't even remember. I think Aziz posted it. I don't even know where you posted it, Aziza. I don't and I said, "Oh," and so anything, I'm white, so being a white therapist, group therapist in groups where I'm hoping for diversity, cultural, ethnic, and I'm a group therapist in the U.S. So until I open my mouth, I am a white American, and um, so I think I've heard you speak before, Donna. Maybe at AGPA or somewhere. So somewhere.
I get around.
You get about it. Yes. So these I've heard you speak. So I saw your names and I was excited and I wanted to be here.
Okay, cool. Well, one of the things I wanted to talk about tonight is this idea of I've been for many years, I've been intrigued by the idea of cultural enactments, right? So, and I think this started, so I used to teach and, pull articles and things from my classes. And one of the people who I really enjoyed reading was Crystal Yarborough. And back in 2017, she wrote this wonderful article. I don't know if you were familiar with it, Aziza, but called Being the Only One. And she was not writing about groups, she was writing about dyads, about working with individuals, but she wrote a wonderful article about the therapist and the client and their cultural enactments with each other and how they both brought their lived experience with each other into the room and how that played out. Right. So I began to wonder, what happens when we do this work? What happens when we as therapists um, begin to do enactments? And usually we think about enactments as something really complicated that happens that we have to analyze and all of that. But really, for me, cultural enactments in particular begin sometimes even before a person comes in the door. Right. So I'll give you an example. For me, as a Black American therapist who grew up here, in the 60s and so forth, and who worked before there was internet, right? So now, you look up your therapist, you go on Psychology Today, you go, poof, that's who I'm going to see. It's Aziza. Now I know what she looks like, right? But back then, when I started working, you couldn't do that. There was no internet. You could not look people up. So my first piece of awareness was that people didn't know who they were coming to see. They didn't know what I looked like. They knew what I sounded like because they would have spoken to me on the telephone. But I have a pretty neutral accent, right? So you can't really identify me racially by how I speak, which is true of a lot of African Americans who have been educated because they've had to speak in a certain way to get to where they are. Um, so I would have this anticipatory anxiety in the beginning every time someone came to my door, right? Every time I was wondering, are they going to be shocked? How are they going to react when they see me? Are they going to want to stay? I mean, it's all this craziness, going through my head. And to me, that's the beginning of a cultural enactment, right? Because I'm all discombobulated just based on how a person might react. Forget how they actually are reacting. And then, of course, we have the moment of truth when someone comes through the door. What do? And how do you proceed then with, is there surprise? Is it shock and awe? What happens at that point? So this became sort of this theme in terms of me wanting to work with people around difference, and around these cultural enactments. The other person who talks a lot about cultural enactments is Kimberly Leary. And I think, she was one of the first people who I think I came across, at least, who talked about racial enactments, because she was talking about that back in 2000. And the definition that she has is she talks about enactments as being interpersonal repetitions in the therapeutic space, right? Is that kind of how you all understand enactments? Does that make sense? Yeah. Okay. Um, and she specifies that these are interactive sequences that basically embody the actualization in the clinical situation of cultural attitudes towards race and racial difference. And these are specifically racial enactments. But I think it's the same thing can be said about culture in general, right? We end up, and this is why, I don't know about you, but this is what I love about doing group work, because all of this, as opposed to this going on between two people and not really, knowing what's going on and so forth, and having to kind of process it, and being able to see it unfold with a group of people is just, well, it's both terrifying and fascinating at the same time, because you have 7, 8, however many people you have in the group, bringing all of this into the room, bringing their culture, bringing their experience, and of course enacting different things. And we have, volumes and volumes. I'm surrounded by books in my office here of people talking about these enactments, or talking about what people bring in the room, but talking about it in terms of things like sibling rivalry,
Mm.
how people handle conflict, whatever avoidance they might have with emotions and things like that, people's how they bring in their families, and their family of origin mattering, and all of these things, right? These are all things we're very familiar with, the literature covers, and so forth. But they don't, it's only been recently, thanks to people like Aziza, that there's been any discussion or writing about cultural enactments, let alone racial enactments, right? There's all this avoidance. As a matter of fact, just because I like saying things like this, I said, well, wait a minute, Donna, before you start saying this in public, you better make sure of what you're talking to. So I'm very dutifully reading Yalom's book. The latest edition, I think, is the 6th edition or the 7th edition. And the book is like this thick, right? And it's like the Bible, it's the group therapy Bible. And I'm going through it and reading because I was writing this chapter. And I'm looking up in the index, and I'm trying to find words like cultural enactment, microaggression. I mean, anything related to, and I found 2 paragraphs, I think, and they were very general, just like, well, and we have to attend to differences or something like that, right? In this big, 600-page book, whatever it is, 2 little paragraphs. And I think there's something about that represents how much avoidance we have about these topics, and it's baffling to me, because I know that enactments basically have to do with how we've been socialized, right? What we've learned in our families, what we repeat, and so forth. And so clearly we've been socialized to, at least in this country, avoid topics around difference, especially difference in race. We leave it alone. And then our theories, our theoretical orientations, um, enable us to avoid, right? Because traditionally we think about um, theories being about maybe intrapsychic issues, or, for group work, focusing on the here and now, and not bringing in the broader socio-political cultural context, right? Because that's out there. That's the broader world. And so it's problematic on many levels, right? That is a problem if we keep doing that, and not focusing on it. And I'm curious. So here's where I need some audience participation here, because what I'm really curious about is why you think that is, right? I have my own thoughts about why we avoid that. First, I want to know whether or not you agree with me that there's been this avoidance out there, that we don't do this. and I want to know why you think that is. So you can put that in the chat if you're not comfortable speaking, or you can speak up. There aren't that many of us here, so feel free to stay unmuted. But I'm really curious. I want this to be an interpersonal experience, not a webinar.
I mean, I think I agree with you. For me, it's always that my experience is that we are socialized out of talking about these things because it's impolite, and that is a function of white supremacy to not talk about these things. And so one thing gets to be normal, and a lot of other things are othered, but it would be rude, particularly in certain regional cultures, Southern, what have you, to bring that up. And so I think a lot of times people are socialized early on not to talk about it, and then they don't have the tools to talk about it later on when they might be willing, but they don't know how to start or where to go.
So it would be rude or impolite. What else? Anyone else have any thoughts about why this topic is avoided like the plague? Why people struggle so much to engage with each other around differences, whether it be in our individual therapy work or doing group work? What do you think? And again, the chat is live and well. People can fearing perceived conflict. So, Annalisa, do you mean like people are anticipating that conflict may occur? Is that what you mean? Okay. Okay. So yeah, that's a good one too. So we fear that there's somehow, because of, I guess, racial tensions in the United States in particular, not having enough information or whatever, but somehow there's going to be conflict, which I find fascinating because there are certain schools of thought, especially with group work, such as modern analytic and so forth, where conflict is alive and well, and it's one part of what you work towards, not avoiding. But when it comes to race, they still avoid it, right? Even the modern analytic folks. Any
I
other
think
thoughts?
why I brought it up that I'm white. So as a white group leader, and my groups are mostly white, and when people of color come for assessment sessions, so I do, because usually when I started on this path with my groups, I would not tell anything about the group members to the new person who was joining the group. So if I had an ongoing group, right? And then I changed that racial differences. I actually do talk. So if this would be an only person of color, I started bringing that up. Because I felt that I kind of somehow I owe that, but I think I was coming with this fear that, oh, like, how will that be? Or so and sometimes people appreciated that I talked about that during the assessment, and they maybe did not join the group because they were afraid that it would be too much. Even though I was of course hoping that me bringing it up ahead of time, it would ease, or like I would come across like showing that I can hold it or do hold, but then I of course respected that they decided not to. And then sometimes when people, so white people go like into this freeze mode that, oh my God, like if it's coming up, the race is coming up, like, and just, and then kind of the air freezes in the room. It's like,
Oh, that's perfect. The air freezes in the room. I actually did a talk not too long ago, which was called "And Then I Froze." Because I think that's what we do, right? We have this freeze response, like, "Oh my God, what do I do now?" All right, so there are a couple of people who just came in. Jaleesa, thank you so much for showing your video. I really appreciate it because I like to see who I'm talking to. And feel free, unless you have a lot of noise in the background, to unmute, just because we're a small group and that way it's a little bit more intimate. And I don't feel all alone here on the camera. But we're talking about cultural enactments. and what gets in the way, what the barriers are. So Brooke's saying there's also a component, especially for trainees, and I just lost the chat, and early career therapists, of course, where we're worried about coming across as making assumptions about our patients. Where I would love for you to say more about that. When there are non-shared identities, so often gets avoided in favor of focusing on DSM symptoms and other things that are more clear. Ooh, would you be willing to say a little bit more about that, to elaborate on that? Ah, okay, okay, no problem. But typing is fine. You know, this is part of diversity, right? Accepting different ways of communicating. So we're good. We're good. I appreciate you doing that. Um, Anyone have any thoughts about what Brooke is saying here? Worried about coming across as making assumptions? Because I think that I think Brooke's onto something there.
Oh,
Something you said earlier, Donna, about being conscious of how people perceive you. I remember doing an externship at Barnard, which is predominantly white and affluent. Um, and the way the offices are set up is the first time a client sees you, you sort of pop out. And so like you don't know who you're about to see, but also you're thinking to, or at least for me, it was like, okay, I'm a large body size, I'm a Black woman, I have natural hair that's usually out. And what is this person's response going to be to them seeing me come out to get them? And so being and I had great supervisors that helped me sort of like think about and process that and work through it. But remembering that I had a self-consciousness about, as much as I think that I'm good at this and I'm really working hard to be good at it, and I'm studious, still feeling very like somebody else might perceive me as not competent or what have you because of these aspects of culture and identity.
Mhm. And part of that, since you brought that up, is that not only, because I want to be very clear, part of the work that I do is trying to be very clear from the get-go that this is not just a white problem, right? It is not just white clinicians who avoid this topic, but people of color do as well. And part of that is due to what we internalize about ourselves, about professionalism, about what we should or shouldn't talk. And we don't like making people uncomfortable either. In fact, I know that personally, I have a long history of having learned how to make white people very comfortable, and I'm very good at it. I don't like it, and I'm tired of it, and I try not to do it anymore. But it is so ingrained, that conflict, that was brought up earlier, like wanting to avoid conflicts. I just want to, draw your attention to what Brooke was writing here, saying, I supervise a lot of trainees in a trauma-focused program, and race and other diverse identities come up a lot. But often trainees and inexperienced therapists are worried, similar to what you're saying, worried that if they address it in the room, the patient will feel that they are being stereotyped, and will view the therapist through a negative lens, racist, homophobic, transphobic, etc. Okay. All right. Thank you so much. I appreciate, you not being in a space where you can speak freely, but I appreciate you participating via chat, especially small group. We can do whatever we want here because it's a small group, right? You're recording this, so I got to be careful. um,
Recording and editing if necessary.
okay, all right. So a lot of Tamala Nara, who I adore, I absolutely love her writing. She notes, and she's a psychoanalyst, so she's coming from a particular perspective and a certain particular training. I'm actually also a psychoanalyst, so I kind of understand where she's coming from. She notes that psychoanalytic clinicians in particular they actually have a reputation amongst Black, Indigenous, and people of color, right, of clients, of minimizing contextual issue, so the therapists are, there's a reputation out there. This is something that comes up amongst people of color, that therapists minimize contextual issues that are critically important to development and mental health. Okay? And here's the thing. I don't know about you all because, I did do my master's in psychology, but I didn't continue. I switched to social work. So in social work studies, this is one of the hallmarks. I mean, this is a part of our code of ethics is you will learn, you must deal with difference. You need to work with people who are different from you. You cannot shy away from that. You can't just refer them out. You have to be willing, ready, and able to work with them, right? The problem is again, I don't know about your graduate school experience, but no one ever taught me how to do that. They said you should, yeah, you should do that, but there's no skill building. And I've asked psychologists, counselors, marriage and family therapists. I ask this question all the time. Did anybody ever teach you how to do that? I'm pretty sure the answer would be no here too. And anyone in this room learn how to do that? Just raise your hand, either virtually or otherwise.
I learned some things.
How to work, like how to name it in the room, or yeah.
How to name it? What'd you learn, Julissa?
I mean, I went to school. I recently graduated maybe like 2 years ago from my PhD program, and a lot of focus was around multicultural pieces, and how that shows up. And perhaps this is because of where I was in the country. I was in the Southwest at the time. But I mean, in the here and now, right? What's happening between you and I, me as a Black woman, you as a, a queer, a white woman, white male, Latinx woman, right? Really just kind of directly speaking to it. But I do think, to Brooke's point, how it does get tricky, right, is if you don't know how to hold it yourself, right? I name it, then what? I can't predict what the other person says, what my client says, right? Where do I go from there? And I think that is possibly why, someone might shy away from naming it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So we have obstacles that were related to fear. What else was like impolite, being, just social norms such as politeness or, and so forth. Fear of conflict, not knowing where to go next, right? You name it and then what? Right? Because that's the way I learned too. Just, I learned like you should name it, you should say something. And so I would say something really awkward like, well, you know, um, I just, I wanted to point out that there, clearly are differences in the room. You're white, I'm not. I didn't say it quite like that, but it sort of ended up sounding that way, and it would be the equivalent of like this brick just dropping in the middle of the room, thunk, and it wouldn't go anywhere. And so this idea of where do you go next? Brooke's continuing, not getting a lot of training on it in her PsyD program. Okay, lots of discussions about inequities. Okay, same as social work. Clearly, we learned about inequities. Um, Here we go. But I think we're still lingering in the era of belief that patients can only be effectively treated by providers who share their identity and experience. So the overall message is these are huge issues, but you won't be able to make a difference in them unless you have lived them. Anyone else have that experience in agency settings? That this tendency, and this comes from, I think this comes from a very well-intentioned place. Like, great, we want a Latina worker so she can work with this Puerto Rican client because, of course, all Latinas and Hispanic folks are the same. And so they'll communicate well together because they can both speak Spanish. Okay. Maybe that's true, and maybe it's not. I have a lot of things in common with African American folks, and I will say that oftentimes that is why people choose me. It's not why they stay with me, right? And we have a lot of differences. A lot of projections go on, even with same supposedly cultural backgrounds. A lot of people like come in and think I'm much more religious than I am. And they'll say, well, and I'm like, well, no, I don't. Right. So there's a lot of difference anyway. And yeah, I agree that this notion of assigning people based on race is helpful to a point, but it has its limitations. And it could be even more interesting if we mix it up a little bit. And that's what we do in groups, since this is Division 49 and we're talking about group work here. I think mixing it up, I think not mixing it up is a missed opportunity. Put it that way. I think it is a missed opportunity. Garen, who I used to use her textbook for my diversity class, one of the things she and company identified 3 major obstacles in clinical work, right? Racial dynamics, internalized racism, and inattention to issues of power and privilege. And I certainly see this playing out in all of our training, be it training, goodness knows I've had enough training, but whether it be training to work with individuals from a clinical social work perspective, be it psychoanalysis or group work, it seems to play out across the board, where just not enough attention is paid to this. There's a lot of talk about it, especially since George Floyd's murder, like, oh, we should be doing this. We could do better. But still people are very reluctant, right? And here's the thing, given the larger socio-cultural context of racism and racial dynamics, there's also this piece about not wanting to be thought of as racist. That is certainly a barrier, not wanting to be thought of as the oppressor. But here's the thing, a lot of us actually share 2 identities or more. Some of us share identities as oppressed and oppressor. And that there's a lot of work to be done around that. I, for one, certainly share those identities. However, I have yet to find a space that's really conducive to exploring that in any depth. If you find one, let me know, because I want to go. So what ends up happening is, between all of the stuff that you've mentioned, personal dynamics, social dynamics, and things, we end up with silence, right? We end up with not doing the work. We sort of do the work a little bit around maybe sexism, possibly around homophobia and things like that, but we don't do the work so much around race. Okay, so we have this collective silence. And there are a lot of people who have been talking about this collective silence, right? Leon Powell believes that this collective silence basically limits our ability to explore and treat any of the effects of racism, racialized trauma, and implicit bias. I'm losing things here. And implicit bias and privilege. Oh, here it is. Now I have it in my notes. Remember, I mentioned I mentioned Yalom's latest book. Yes, so there are 818 pages in that book. There are 800. It's the 6th edition of the Theory and Practice of Group Psychotherapy, which, again, considered a classic. And there's the only mention I could find. I found issues around 2 paragraphs around culture and gender diversity, and they were housed underneath the idea of group homogeneity, right? So they were within the context of, well, you don't want, for instance, a singleton in the group. You want to try to have, if you're going to, you want to attend to diversity, you want to make sure you don't have just one woman or one man. You want to have more than one person, and the problems that can arise from that. And they mention racial enactments, but they don't really say anything more about it. They just say that actually, no, they don't. I'm sorry, they don't mention racial enactments. They just say, underneath this idea of how forming a group and it being consistent and so forth, and creating this homogeneity, that it's important, right? So, my question is, how is neglecting this topic possible in our particular environment, in a world that has become increasingly xenophobic and intolerant of racial, ethnic, and religious differences? What do we do about this? How do we get stuck here? Any thoughts?
I thought that to me, this whole issue, or the one where I can enter into it, is through power and privilege. That's where I feel that's where the rubber hits the road, I guess. And it's difficult because, I mean, there's so many reasons, but that, I guess, because I think group theory kind of started from psychoanalytic thinking. So we are thinking about the dynamics that are like, what am I disowning that I could own? But power and privilege is often something that I never knew I had it. So I'm so unconscious of it that I cannot recognize that. So it's somehow I don't know, further away in the unconscious, or in the unawareness at least. But then it's so important because it comes through when I talk, how I talk, if I even show up, how I show up. So it's like starts right from the beginning. And like, oof.
And you may be more familiar with the dynamics of gender.
Yeah.
When you walk in a room and when you talk, you know, all the things that you were just saying, how you talk, how you walk in the room, and so forth. So, you know, intersectionality plays a huge role here as well, whereby, you know, the conversation is different if I'm talking to white males than it is if I'm talking to white females, or females of different colors and so forth. You know, it's a different conversation because they automatically have unearned privilege, just as, you know, male privilege. So yes, definitely, I would agree with you that power and privilege, you can't avoid that. And that's true of your groups, right? If I'm facilitating a group, well, look at me now. Right? So I'm here talking to you all about a subject that I ostensibly have expertise in. So that gives me a lot of power in this room, right? I don't always feel that power. I mean, I can, you know, walk out. I'm at home now, so I could like walk through my door there, walk out into the street, and just be some African American woman walking down the street with whatever gets projected onto that, right? They don't know how many degrees I have, or that I just did this presentation for APA, and that, you know, it doesn't matter. So context is very important as well. So I have some ideas about things that we can do, because that's part of what I do. But I think it's important to start. I think this was said earlier. Yeah, to start with how we invite the discussion. Because if you don't invite the discussion, nothing's ever going to happen. And I think you were onto something in terms of talking about it before people actually are sitting down in a session with you, be it group or individual. Because I think that's where it starts. I think that's where people learn about you and about what you're interested in. And if they screen themselves out, oh well. I know that's not a popular thing to say, especially if you're trying to get enough people in a group to run a group. But you know, it's important, because depending on what you're looking to achieve in your group, it may be important that that person screens themselves out if they're that uncomfortable that they can't have a conversation about difference. The groups that I run, because I'm me and this is what I do, are all intercultural on some level, with the exception of my BIPOC group. So I do run a group for Black and Brown therapists of color. And that's a very different type of group, because it's kind of an affinity group. And they're still basking in the glow of being together, and not a lot of conflict there, because they're just so happy to be together, or after 3 years. But my intercultural groups are also very intentional. And even the trauma group that I run is intercultural. Again, I think it's because I'm me, and because I seek that out. And that's because, you know, that's what I put out into the world. And I say, this is what I want to be doing. I run two intercultural groups, or will be two intercultural groups for therapists as well. They're training process groups. And interestingly enough, this is what happens with these groups. And I don't have any theory. Well, I might have some theories about it. But so what happens in my world is I'll put an ad out, say, hi, these are my groups. I have openings in my intercultural group. And I say, this is a group for people who are interested in exploring interpersonal relationships, as well as dynamics around power and privilege, and blah, blah, blah. I'll say something along those lines. Who do you think are the first people who, you know, respond? Anybody? What do you think the backgrounds are of the people who respond initially?
I think folks who identify as white, Caucasian, European.
Yep. White,
Yeah,
Caucasian, European,
it's
women,
women, yeah.
not men, not men. So the people who are like beating my door down are all white women who have had some anti-racism training or exposure, and they want more. They're so hungry for these conversations, and they're afraid they're not going to have them in other groups. So they're the first ones. And so I joke because I end up having like white woman's waiting list. Um, for any time I'm starting one now, which one in January, and again, it's the same pattern over, and it's always the white women who sign up first. I have more difficulty. I do get men in these groups. The men who come in the groups tend to be biracial or bicultural men who want to explore whatever aspect of their identity they felt was ignored growing up. You know, um, maybe they're Asian and white, and they're much more in touch with the white piece because also education, proximity to whiteness as you go through, because these are all therapists, so they're people, with master's degrees and PhDs and so forth. So they've all been in the same environments we've all been in, which tend to be predominantly white. So they want to explore the other aspects of their identity. And I will say that the white people who are interested are not just people who've gone to anti-racism trainings. They tend to also be people who might have adopted children or might be in interracial relationships or something else going on in their family where they've been exposed to another culture or something like that. But it's interesting to see who shows up and who doesn't. Um, and I start having this conversation during the screening process. Why do you want to come here? Why is this important to you? What would it be like if someone accused you of committing a microaggression or saying something harmful and so forth? How do you think you would react? So I test the waters that way. I have people kind of think, has that ever happened to you before? And I do it across the board. It doesn't matter. People of color, people of color want to know, well, what would be interesting to you talking in a group like this, considering the fact that you've probably been in intercultural or predominantly white spaces your whole life? Why would you want to be here now? What do you hope to get out of this? What do you imagine would send you running out the room? That kind of a thing. What mistakes might I make that would be a deal breaker? Okay. So I also believe very much in the use of self. I identify myself as, my positionality as a Black woman, and being interested in this topic, and I tell them a little bit about why. So that's the first step, really, is kind of doing that. And also, I mean, obviously, maybe not obviously, but I'm going to assume it's obviously because this is what they do teach us in school, doing your own work around this. Right, your own self-awareness, your own examining your own implicit biases, beyond taking my favorite test, the Harvard implicit bias test. Everybody know about that? I joke about it, but it's actually an interesting little test, and some interesting things can come out of it if you take a few different ones. Sometimes pleasant, sometimes not so much. Um, So, the first thing is all this awareness work, right? And I think one of the things that's often neglected by people who identify as white are that they're not used to thinking of themselves in racialized terms, right? I am conscious every day, especially in this country, as a Black American walking out in the world. I know that it's like I'm very aware of that. Um, Depending on what group I'm speaking to, I can be more or less aware of it. It depends. Um, but in this country, white people are not used to identifying themselves as white. It's still a challenge, even now, even after George Floyd, after all the anti-racist training and so forth. It is so hard for people to do that. Usually, oftentimes I'll hear something like, "Well, I don't like to identify myself as white," and I'm like, "Well, why not? Why? What's the problem?" And what they're really saying is what? Anyone have any idea what that really means? What people are saying by that?
I don't want to be a racist. I want to
Yeah,
be.
I don't want to I don't want to identify myself as a racist. I don't want you to think I'm racist. I don't
Mhm.
want, all of that negativity. Um, or they'll say, well, I don't consider myself white, I'm Jewish. I'm like, okay,
Mhm.
and religion can certainly play in here. I did that is a really important aspect of one's identity, or it can be, but you're still white. And because walking out in the world as a Jewish person, some people may recognize that depending on how Jewish you look. But it's not the same as people recognizing me as Black. They're going to see that like from a mile away. I'm going to have to look a little bit harder to ascertain whether or not you're Jewish. And probably the only reason I can is because I grew up in New York, and lots of Jewish people in New York, and I'm really very, very familiar with whatever characteristics present themselves. And I can be wrong, right? Because that's not always a good way of determining someone's background. Right. But so using your own racial identity is important, including if you happen to be a white person, even and maybe especially if you're speaking to other white people. Right. So not just using that when you're speaking to a person of color to kind of, somehow gain their trust or whatever, but saying that to white people as a form of disclosure. Because I say as a Black woman, blah, 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 I think this, or this is important to me. So I'm going to give you some examples, and you may have some yourself, of cultural enactments. And I just want to say that, well, they kind of fall in different categories. So I'm going to try to give some examples of that are more interesting than me just talking about theory. One, one really easy one, which happens a lot and is a little amusing, is last year I went to Mexico. And I myself have been always in a process group of some kind. So I'm in my process group, where I am a participant as opposed to the leader, which is always a good thing. And the facilitator, the leader, said to me, mind you, I've been in this, it's not like this is a new group. I've been in this group for a couple of years. And of everyone in the group, I think there was another person who was biracial, and then there was me. Everyone else was white. So the facilitator very carefully and cautiously says something along the lines of, well, I'm not sure if this is appropriate to say, because he's also not American, but I noticed, that you have a tan. I'm wondering if it's okay for me to say that. So I fell on the floor. No, after I picked myself up off the floor, I said, well, and I was cracking up. I'm like, yeah, and I said something like, yes, Black people do tan to different degrees, but yeah, that's a thing. And it's okay if you acknowledge that. You could say, Donna, what a nice tan you have. And I'm not going to, but he was worried that might offend me. So right there, we're in this kind of weird cultural enactment. That's not a serious one. I mean, I'm not offended. It's not a major rupture or anything like that. The group didn't gasp, but they're all kind of looking at it like, what? And the only thing I said, I laughed and I said, Black people do tan, and yes, it's appropriate for you to make that comment, at least as far as I'm concerned. I'm not gonna be worried about that. And in fact, I like it when I'm tan. I happen to like my complexion. It's a little redder, and so it's something I enjoy. So that's one kind of thing, that's like a facilitator just oblivious of, or trying not to be, but being very overly cautious, and trying not to do a faux pas or anything like that, because God forbid. The thing is, we have to get over ourselves with that, right? Because we're going to make mistakes. I make mistakes all the time. We're going to say something that's going to offend somebody, and because if you never offend anybody, you're not doing the work.
And I'm
never offend.
imagining that, I was just thinking, I'm imagining myself if I were that group facilitator. So if I notice your tan, I would feel terrible if I didn't say it. So if it was a white person with a tan, I would more likely say it. And so I'm thinking, oh, why am I not saying it to Donna? Like, oh. So either way, I would freak out.
It's the mental gymnastics that we go through, right? And that's a mild example, right? It's, you know, that now, fortunately, in this particular case, the facilitator was open
Mm.
to my feedback and transparent about the discomfort they were feeling, right? And the comment being, you know, worried that the comment would be inappropriate. So they were open to engaging in a conversation around that. I've been in situations where other people just kind of shut that down, no conversation, we're not going to go there. And there wasn't any room for me to say anything. Um, you know, so again, Leary, one of my favorite people, Kimberly Leary says, you know, the most common racial enactment has been our silence about racial issues. That is the most common one, and perhaps the most damaging, I would add.
Yeah.
So, you know, so I usually get into microaggressions at this point because microaggressions are racial enactments. They're cultural enactments. Just so that we can be on the same page here, anyone want to venture a definition of microaggressions? I know who I'm talking to. Aziza's in the room. Anyone other than Aziza? What comes to mind when I say microaggression? Anyone?
Scary. And I have to leave. I have a patient in 3 minutes. So
You can drop the definition and leave. You want to help us out, Aziza?
Sure. Well, you know, what the person who coined the term says is these are just subtle ways of diminishing and denigrating people whose identities are marginalized. So starting out specifically talking about the experience of Black people, even when it's a compliment, it's a way of stereotyping and not seeing the person in front of you, but making an assumption about who they are and then ultimately a comment or action.
And the only reason we refer to them as micro, because inevitably someone will say they're not micro at all, they feel macro. But the only reason they're micro is because they tend to be very subtle lights, right? And what makes it even more challenging is whether or not it's a microaggression is defined by the person experiencing it, not by the person committing it. And it's really important because that's where we get into a whole bunch of trouble, right? Where someone says something that someone reacts to, considers to be a microaggression, and the other person who wants to be a very nice, either a nice man or a nice white person or a nice whatever, and doesn't want to be considered problematic in that way, will vehemently argue that they didn't intend that, they didn't mean it, they didn't mean to offend, and so forth. But meanwhile, we have someone who's hurt over here. And so how we deal with that is very important, regardless of the type of microaggression it is. So Daryl Wing Sue, who's the person who kind of took it and ran with it. The original person was Pierce, who was a Black psychiatrist. And he's the one that started talking about it, and it was very specific to people of color. But Daryl Wing Sue kind of expanded that and broadened it to also include issues around gender and sexuality, etc., and specifically talks about micro invalidations, micro insults, and micro assaults. The latter being the most obvious one, like I call you a name, right? That's a micro insult. It's very obvious, it's deliberate, there's no question what it's about. You know, whenever someone makes a racial slur or something like that, or demeans a woman, you know, that's very obviously an assault. But the other ones are more subtle.
Don, I just want
So
to, Brooke mentioned they had a training in their clinic which advocated for them saying I think speaking in draft or speaking my first draft to acknowledge when we're having a conversation that I might get this wrong or I'm doing with what I have right now. And also I'm willing to be corrected, and I know that I still have work to do, I guess. So
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think people have been using that terminology more and more lately, speaking in draft, just so that people understand. And I think in groups, it's really a good thing because we want our clients and patients to be able to not feel like they have to filter themselves and pre-process things before it comes out of their mouth. So I think speaking in draft is a great thing. It's so much better than saying, "Well, I don't mean to offend, but."
mhm.
This is like my favorite thing. As soon as someone says that, you know they're going to say something blatantly offensive. And you're like, why did you continue that sentence? But but at least if they're saying this, to me it indicates I'm trying here. I'm open. You know, I want feedback, but I realize that what I'm saying may not be, may have an impact on somebody. And that's the thing, kind of recognizing the impact we have on people, right? Just because I'm a Black woman doesn't mean that I am not going to have a negative impact on another person of color. I certainly I have, and I can, and I do want to speak to that a little bit because this internalized racism stuff and the things that we carry with us as people of color sometimes can be just as damaging, maybe even more so, because it's coming from another person of color, right? And I think the first time I encountered that, so just as an aside, the reason that I do, well, one of the things that I've been trained in working around race and dynamics around um, intercultural communications and so forth was training that I did with Le Manoir in California. And uh, what that training consisted of was us meeting as cohorts, online actually before there was people were doing Zoom before the pandemic and all of that. And it was a cohort, and so it was very racially balanced and so forth. And one, I don't know what we were talking about, but we were talking about something. And there was another person of color. Well, there were several other people of color in there, but there was a woman of color who's was darker complexion than I am. And I think the facilitator just inquired, hey, what's going on with you? I noticed that you're a little quiet or something. And she said, well, I actually think that people are paying more attention to Donna.
Mm.
And I'm like, uh-oh, what's going on? I'm bracing myself. And it's like, um, what's that about? And she said that she felt that people were paying more attention to what I said because of my proximity to whiteness.
Mm.
She said, you are lighter skinned than I am. And I've noticed that when you speak, people engage with you more, they interact with you more. And that was the first time in my life I had ever, first of all, been called light skinned because I've never considered, I never thought of myself that way. But of course, compared, depending on context, who you're comparing yourself to, I guess I never thought of myself as dark skinned either. So I had to kind of deal with that and sit with that, as opposed to getting defensive and say, I'm not light skinned. I could have gone that route. But I was like, it was very upsetting to me. It's like, oh my goodness. And I had to think about it. And as did other people in the room have to reflect on, are we paying more attention to or less attention
Mm.
to, people based on this dynamic? And we're all in a training on intercultural communication, facilitating conversations about race. That's why we were there. And this enactment's going on in the room, right? So that was an eye opener for me. I mean, there are many things about that training which were life transforming, but that one was huge. So that kind of a thing that happens in terms of cultural enactments between people of color, which often is unspoken for so many reasons, including not being a safe space to talk about things like that. So these are things that we rarely get to in our groups. Like it's hard for me to even get to that in my group that's full of people of color, right? Because
Yes.
there's so much emotion with that and it can be so shaming.
And sometimes I think people feel like, one, in front of other people, that's we don't air our dirty laundry.
Yep. Hmm.
So whatever is going on between us as people of color, but or folks with marginalized identities, And then because we know the harm, we live with it, many of us, we don't want to do anything that's going to make somebody else relive their harm or perpetuate that harm. And so then we just try and not do that.
So first and foremost, as I said, after you've done your awareness, your explorations around your own implicit biases and all of that really good work that is necessary. Um, the other thing is this is going to sound really obvious, but putting yourself in situations where you're interacting with different people. Because I've had so many people say, oh, well, I want to work with people who are different, but they just don't come to me. So asking yourself, why is that? Why is that? And again, this is for people of color too. I used to have a practice that was predominantly white, and I had to look at that. I had to like, what's this? And it wasn't because I wasn't accepting insurance, because at that time I was, right? I was accepting insurance and things like, so I had to really look at my website, the information that I put out in the world, what I say about myself, how I describe myself even, and be very intentional about how I am in the world. My practice is almost entirely people of color now, which has been an interesting transformation, just becoming more cognizant about it, more cognizant about who I want to be working with and what that is, and that's just happened over the years. But so asking yourself, why do people come and see you? Why do they stay? What information are you putting out into the world? Are you putting out into the world that it's important for you to have a multicultural practice, or to run multicultural groups? Are you living in an area where that's even possible or not? And if you are, would you consider working in an area that's more diverse, or where more diverse populations can get to you? I cannot say enough about not letting microaggressions go when they happen in the room. And what I mean by that is I don't always see them. All right. I do this work. I do this every day. I live and breathe this work. I miss things. Right. So I accept that I'm going to miss something, especially in a group. And especially it might be my own blind spot, right? I'm going to miss it. And so being open, putting out into the room that you want people to call these things out or recognize them or say ouch or however you phrase it is so important, because that's an invitation too. And then people worry about, well, what do I do with this? Well, the only thing I'm going to say about what you do with it is recognize it first. You have to name it. You have to say something happened here, even if you do it like that. There is a group intervention that I do based on the mindful facilitation method that I use, which really is, especially if you freeze or you don't know what you have that moment where you're not sure you heard what you just heard, because that happens too. Asking the group, use the group. What just happened here? I have a feeling something just happened. What did you see? What did you notice? And see if someone else will speak up. Oh, I think this happened, or this is what I saw, or whatever. And that gives you a moment. It buys you time to kind of collect yourself, get yourself together, figure out what it is that you want to say about that, because you may not know right away. You might again freeze, which is fine. We're all humans, and sometimes we space out for a minute, disassociate, especially if it's uncomfortable. Right? So use the group to help you, because that's what they're there for. And that's, again, modeling that this is what we do, this is what we talk about. The other piece is not making the mistake of paying attention to the reaction of the person who has microaggressed. What do I mean by that? So when a microaggression occurs, or some other kind of slight that you feel might be culturally based, and I use culture very broadly here, it's really important to acknowledge both parties. The person who was injured and who was saying, ouch, like, ooh, that hurt. Or they may not even be saying that, but maybe their facial expression shows it. And you want to check in with them. What just happened? And the person who, microaggress. You have to be able to hold both of them. And I think that is one of the most challenging things to do. because you could have, probably everyone's heard about white tears, right? We've been talking about that for a long time. What do you do when someone becomes so upset? And this is not just about women, but women are socialized to have this happen, white women. What do you do when in a group, someone says something that has an impact on someone, a negative impact, right? And they didn't intend it. So they feel horrible when the person points it out. You just did this, and this is what happens to, this as a person of color or as a gay person or whatever. This is what happens to me in my life, and da da da. And it just, and they're wounded. And the other person's like, oh, I didn't mean it, and they're horrified. You can see them freeze, and sometimes they get so upset they're crying about it and so forth. Well, what happens in groups is a lot of times all of the attention goes to that person. Everyone in the room is frozen. Then people start explaining, and this and that starts going on. You need to stop that. You need to resist the urge yourself, because remember I said I'm very good and have been very well trained to protect white people. This used to happen to me all the time. With white people, with Black men, there's certain people that I protect a lot. And I would get into that dynamic of going to the person who was well intended but made a major gaffe in some way. And that's probably the worst thing that you can do. Right? You have to acknowledge them, because if not, it'll just get worse. Either they'll start sobbing more, or if they're angry, they'll become more angry, or they'll become more agitated. Something will happen. Well, they will make their presence known because they need to be attended to. So you can acknowledge them and say, well, I see you have a strong reaction to what just happened, and I want to talk about that. But first, I want to go to this other person over here who, was the recipient. So I'm going to pause here. Does that make sense? To like hold the two in the same because that's hard to do. It's really challenging. Julissa, you're the only person I can see, so aside from Aziza, so I'm just going to ask you. Oh, Brooke, I love you. That's just because the fact that you're off screen and you're still making sure that we know you're there. It's great. Thank you so much.
But yeah, no, that makes sense. I imagine that's I don't do much group work, but I'm just interested in how it plays out. But I imagine that it is difficult to acknowledge it and kind of pause that for a second. So yeah.
And it can come up in other situations too. This can come up working with couples. It can come up working with families, all types of things where you have this moment where someone said something really egregious and offensive, and, have a reaction to what they said or the impact of what they said, because sometimes it's difficult to experience. Heck, it can come up at the Thanksgiving dining room table. So that's important. If I'm, I don't like rules, and I don't like to say this is what you have to do, but that would be one of my sort of soft rules that, make sure that you're paying attention to the person who has been microaggressed upon first. Then you can tend to the person who was well-intentioned and having a reaction, because now the spotlight's on them and they feel horrible, and they don't mean to be offensive and all those other things. And you can kind of work with that. The other really simple things, so I'm going to give you I'm going to give you 2 mindful facilitation techniques that you can take with you, because I don't like for people to show up for trainings and not have something to take away. So the first one is something that we refer to a lot in clinical training. We sometimes call it active listening and so forth, but it's a reflection. And it sounds very ridiculously easy, but it isn't always. Because really it's along the lines of the Rogerian kind of way of, well, what I heard you say was, and you fill in the blank and you repeat what the person said. And so there are caveats to this. One is it's not paraphrasing, it's not summarizing or anything like that. It literally is repeating what you heard the person say. And if you actually say the words, what I heard you say was, it's helpful, at least in the beginning when you're practicing this, because you want to try to not only repeat what they said, or at least let me be clear about this. You're not trying to repeat the whole thing that they said. So we speak in paragraphs, not in sentences. So you don't want to, this is not a memory test for you to try to regurgitate the entire paragraph of what somebody said, but you're listening, you're active listening, and your culturally responsive listening is for what's important to them and not what's important to you. I want to say that again. What's important to them and not what's important to you. Because the way we are, we're hardwired to kind of seek what we have in common with people. We seek commonality. So in our brains, we kind of go like, oh, and I do this with my clients all the time. Like, oh, wow, you went to Tanzania. I want to go there, and I could get into this whole thing about Tanzania, as opposed to saying, wow, tell me more about your trip to Tanzania, right? Which would be more about them. So the practice of repeating what you heard someone say is important because it means something to people. And it means even more like if you say their name, right? If you pretty much use the tone that they're using and you use their words. So if they curse, use the curse word. If they say something sucks, use the word suck, even if that's not what you would say. Don't reframe it and don't make it and don't clean it up in any way. Say, oh, I hear, it sounds like you're having a hard time. No, that's not what I said. I said life sucks, right? So you want to make sure that you use their words and do that and see what happens. Just reflect back to people. And the reason that it's so powerful when you're dealing with any of these issues having to do with people who have marginalized identities is because they're not used to people doing that. Think about it. They're used to being unseen, unheard, not responded to, etc. So if you can respond to someone in an authentic way and use their words, that is magical. It really is. And again, as I said, it's going to sound really simplistic, but I want everyone in this room to try it tomorrow. Where you simply respond to someone. And then the next piece of that is called an inquiry. So first we have this kind of reflexive thing. First, you're doing kind of reflective listening, basically. And you're doing a reflection based on a couple of important things that you heard the person say. It's important to them, not what's important to you, or intriguing to you, or fascinating to you. And then you can intertwine that with an inquiry. And the inquiry might be as simple as, tell me more. Only you're not going to keep it that vague. You're going to fill it in and make it specific. Tell me more what it was like for you as a Black person to step foot in Tanzania, right? So I just threw in some culture there, as if Aziza just went to Tanzania. I'm having fantasies about Tanzania here. But that's much more specific. It's not just tell me more, right? It's tell me more something specific about what you just said. And you pluck out something that you think is going to be relevant. And you combine that with reflection. What I heard you say is that you just came back from Tanzania. Or even better still, I'm using Aziza because she'll let me pick on her. Aziza, what I heard you say is that you just got back from Tanzania. And you'll say, oh, yeah, I had a good trip. And blah, blah, blah. Huh. Wow. I can only imagine what it was like. You can combine some empathy in there too. Tell me more what it was like for you as a Black woman going to Tanzania. And that's going to be a very different question than someone else might ask you, right? They might ask some very general things, or, oh, I've always thought about going to Tanzania. Then it becomes about them, not her. So this is one way of making it really about the person. And you can do this in individual session. You can do it in group. If you do it in group, you're training your group members to do it, like you're modeling what you want them to be doing. Now, that's just the tip of the iceberg. I do these mindful facilitation trainings all the time, and they involve a series of inquiries intertwined with these reflections. And we have individual inquiries. We also have group inquiries. And but I can't do that in an hour and a half, so I didn't. But I wanted to just throw something out there that might be something that's user-friendly that you can literally use in your conversation with your aunt. I mean, it doesn't, you don't have to be running groups or anything like that. And I meant what I said. The holidays are here. Practice it at the dining room table with relatives, or with kids. I did this to my kids until they started saying, "Stop doing this psychology stuff." All right, Brooke's writing to us. Oh, set the language as the grows. Okay, with veterans. Is everyone reading this? Do I need to read it out loud?
No, I'm reading it.
Yeah. Yeah, as if you they apologize for profanity. Yeah, yep, yeah, absolutely. Yes, that's a really good point, telling people you don't want them censoring themselves and so forth. So yeah, it's a variation on what I do, right? You can say that, you can, certainly set that tone. And then if you repeat it, then they really know it's okay. So I've been talking for an hour and 20 minutes. I am curious if anyone has any thoughts, questions, comments, anything they'd like to share, because I don't usually talk this much in one stretch.
Well, I just appreciate that. I think one of the things I love about you is that you make this very accessible. I feel like anybody can listen and hear it, and if they're open to it, receive it. Because I think that people come to these types of conversations really tense already, defensive tense, where, and anything that we can do to help them bring that down, in addition to taking in the gems that you are providing, always feels productive, I guess.
Thank you for that. I mean, it's important to me because, again, I've been to so many trainings and things, and there's so many things that I dislike about conferences, and one of them is people reading papers to me. I absolutely can't stand it. Or people just using a PowerPoint and nothing else. And I figured this group is so small, I'm not gonna, I mean, I have a PowerPoint, it's hidden behind my windows here someplace. It's like, no, I'm not doing PowerPoint. I can't do
Yeah.
that. I want to just talk to people. So that's important to me. Anything else, Julissa? Anybody, Brooke?
This is related to what you're saying, that I think it was helpful to hear from you and some of the other participants that were here too, and what they've seen in their work. I'm curious for you, because you say you do a lot of group work. Are you also connected to, I think it's NAGPS?
I'm so connected. So, NAGPS being
Mid-Atlantic Group
the
Psychotherapy.
Mid-Atlantic.
Mhm.
I'm loosely connected with them. So because I'm the president of my own local affiliate society, I know all the presidents of the other affiliate societies.
Okay.
I did a presentation for MAGPS like about a year ago, I think, year and a half ago, or something like that.
Okay.
I presented at EGPS, MAGPS, RGP, all the affiliate societies. I was in Louisiana, so I kind of take my show on the road. And I will be presenting Special Institute at AGPA Connect conference in 2025 in San Francisco. So that's my next big appearance. But again, as I said, so there is this good book out there. I'm gonna plug the book by Alexis Abernathy, and it's published by Routledge, and it's available on the AGPA website, and probably it will be on other websites as well. You would think I would know the exact title of that, right? I have it somewhere.
I'll include it in the follow-up email if it's okay, Donna, to folks
Cool.
who registered.
Yeah, it's called, well, I'm honored because I got the first chapter. So my chapter is identifying and working through racialized enactments in group psychotherapy. And the title of the book is Addressing Diversity Dynamics in Group Therapy, Clinical and Training Applications. And the editor is Abernathy. So yeah, that would be great for you to include since it's coming out. And I think, you know, there are a lot of good people who have contributed to this book, and I'm pretty proud of it. And I think it really speaks to tonight's topic. But, you know, I get around out there, so if you Google me, I'll be somewhere. You can, and I sometimes do these mindful facilitation trainings. I'll just do a CE event or something like that. I also teach core principles of group psychotherapy. That's another thing that's good to look out for. And that's given in a lot of different formats out in the world, like sometimes online and sometimes in person. So
Awesome.
I'm around.
Thanks.
Jaleesa, I think Donna would agree with this. We are connected or have been connected with several of the good folks at MAGPS. So
Mm.
it's a very, I mean, you know this probably, it's a very active chapter, and they got some good people doing good things, really trying to do this work.
Yeah, I find it really fascinating. So, yeah. So
Where are you geographically, Jaleesa?
I'm in DC.
You're in DC.
Yeah.
And Aziza, didn't you move to Atlanta or something?
I'm in Atlanta. I'm in
You're in
Atlanta.
Atlanta. So you're the Atlanta group psychotherapy. You're in their
Right.
territory. Okay.
But I'm actually affiliated with EGPS, but that's a whole nother story. Okay,
Yeah.
Donna, I cannot thank you enough. I do want to acknowledge, even though they had to leave, Emily and Annalisa both put in the comments how much they appreciated you. I think I hear nothing about good things about you. I wish I could be in your group, you know, but I am so grateful that you were willing to share this knowledge with us today. I'm grateful that you let us record it for people who couldn't make it. And so I'll check in with you to get the official name of the book so that I can send it out. For those who are still here, for those who attended, for those who are watching it recorded, that information and of course the link for assessment and evaluation will be sent. So thank you so much on behalf of all of Division 49 for this.
Thank you. Thanks for asking me to do this. Appreciate
Any
it.
other questions, comments before we log off? All right. Well, everyone have a good night. And if there are holidays that you celebrate coming up, we certainly hope that they are joyous, relaxing, and safe.
And peaceful. And
Yes.
thank you, Brooke. I saw your text, so that thanks for hanging in there in the chat. I appreciate it.
Good night, everyone, or good afternoon, depending on where you might be.
Care.
All right. Take care, everybody.